Hello there. Welcome back to Key Conversations, the podcast where we talk about all of the things to help you create a sustainable and fulfilling music career. And this season, as you know, it's all about releasing a record. It is something that I am in the trenches right now, in the middle of doing with my new record, Luminary. You can find out and listen to that, find out more at imaluminary.com. So today we're going to be talking all about singles, and I am excited to have Angela here. Angela is the founder of Muddy Paw PR, and she just started Thrive Mentorship Community, which is really exciting. So I'm going to let Angela introduce herself and also say her own last name because I don't want to butcher it. So go ahead, Angela. Thanks for being here.
Sure. It's just like it looks. It's just Angela Master Giacomo. And yeah, your intro is perfect. Muddy Paw PR and Thrive. That's pretty much me in a nutshell, and puppies and dessert. And that's all you need to know, really.
Oh my God, puppies and dessert. Okay, so now we're best friends. Great. Yeah, she's got a dog next to her. I've got a basset hound down at my feet. So it's all, we've got the puppy thing going on for sure. Yeah, so you work in PR, and when you're in PR, your focus is really on out there, right? Like you're like the relationship, and correct me if I'm wrong, the relationship between a fan and the artist themselves and what the fan is receiving. Is that sort of accurate, or how do you see the work that you do with the artist and who?
So we're working primarily with the artist, and for the most part, it's the artist's responsibility to be connecting with their fan. Like, we'll certainly advise them on what they can be doing to strengthen that relationship, and we can give them all kinds of tips. But at the end of the day, it's up to them to actually do the things that we're advising them to do. And then we're working behind the scenes to get those features, get the Spotify playlist, things like that.
Got it. So you're working on the press element of
Yes.
getting them out there so that they can get more fans. And then once they get the fans, it's the artist's responsibility to connect with them.
Yeah, it's all a really beautiful circle. The more
Yeah.
fans, the better press, the more fans.
Yeah. It's like a chicken or the egg. What comes first. And that's awesome. And people that know me know that, like, my whole thing is the fan connection, being really clear on what you want and communicating that with your fans. And I personally do that the best through email. So I have I'm like the email dork of the music industry, which I'm super proud of because it's very effective. But yeah, PR is a whole nother world of like, oh, out there. I've just been in sort of once people are in, I'm really good at loving on them. And I think a lot of musicians are the opposite. They're like, no, I need to get out there. And they're not noticing, oh, I have 150 people on my email list that I'm not doing anything with. And those are 150 people that could be helping me get out there. Because the more people love you and feel connected with you, the more likely they are to go share and help that circle, widen that circle that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when it comes time to release music, what do you think about the idea of singles, just releasing a single on its own without a record? So we'll talk about two things. Let's start with this. So I'm thinking big picture, we've got a record, we're going to release a record. Do we release singles, or how can we get some music out there to sort of tease the record? So that's one part of the conversation. But the other part is, what if you just have one song and you haven't had any records in a while, you haven't gone on tour? Are singles a good way to sort of have something to talk about, or are there other benefits to singles? So let's start with the latter. A one-off single. What do you think about that? What do you advise your clients to do in that situation?
I think it's absolutely better to have a one-off single than nothing at all. If I would rather you release a single and you start figuring it out as you go than to hang on to it and wait for an album, because you're not only losing so much time that way, but you're sort of feeding into the idea that everything has to be perfect, which, as we both know, is just terrible and destructive. So if you have a song, I think it's better to get it out there, experiment, like see what's working. It's such a great time in the beginning of your career to be able to test different things and try different things and just see what's sticking.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really great. At what point do you say, okay, I need to stop putting these singles out because I do want to make a record?
It's so funny. I've heard so many artists do it so many different ways, from like just releasing the album to just releasing singles. And personally, I kind of like the happy medium of it, where you get a bit of traction going. I think that's the key. Release singles until you get a bit of traction going. And by that, I mean that you have a fan base, like it doesn't have to be a huge one, but they're engaged, they're paying attention. You can see that what you're doing on your social media and in your live shows, like you can see that that's all working. And then I think that's when it's time to think, okay, how do I put this out in a larger format? And for me, for a band that's just starting out, especially, I'm actually a fan of EPs over albums if it's like your first or second one, because I think, again, you're still in that experimentation phase and figuring out what works. But I think that's the point at which you you start to think, okay, what's next, is when you do start to have that traction.
Yeah. So it sounds like do you work with a lot of artists that are sort of first time record, coming up to the idea of maybe releasing an EP sort of earlier on in their
Yeah.
careers?
Yeah, we work with a lot of artists that are between just barely having started releasing and on maybe like their second or third album or EP.
Awesome. Cool. So for I know that in my world of in the key of success, there are a lot of artists that are not necessarily veterans yet in the music industry, but they are on their later CDs and they've sort of done, okay, I've done all the things I know to do, now what? So I love being in that space of now what? So for the artists that are listening that are not just beginners, what where does a single come into play if they've got their, they've sort of got a rhythm going of releasing, maybe they're performing live regularly, where does the single play into that sort of scenario?
I think at that point, the single becomes a really fun area to just play. Like,
Yeah.
I think that you can, I mean, depending on what your single is about or the album that it comes off of eventually, I think that's where you start to tap into the branding of it. Like, what is this actually about? How do I get creative about this? How do I get creative marketing strategies? Like, what non-music outside the box blogs or podcasts or events, like, how do I get it out there through those avenues? How do I do a creative marketing campaign around it? Because when you're at that point where you're a bit later in your career and you know your audience, you know what you're putting out is working and you're just looking to take it to the next level, I think that's when something like marketing in a really creative brand specific way becomes really valuable.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I got asked to write a theme song for a live event for the nonprofit Girls Inc. And they wanted to be able to promote the song after the event. And so I was like, I'm in no position to, I was in the middle of a tour cycle and I had just released a CD the year before and I wasn't ready to do another one. So for me, that was a great reason to release a single. So there was there were links on iTunes and the organization could promote it. And also people that were at this event could go download it. And I just wanted the one song out there. And that was the first time that was, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but that was the first time I was like, oh, I don't need to make a whole album just to get this one piece of music out there. So I think it can also work in the reverse way. When you have an opportunity that calls for one song and you need to get it out there, that's a great reason to release a single, so to speak.
Well, that's back to the experimentation too, right? Like, if you do have something, say you're thinking, okay, I want to try a slightly different sound, or like this theme is really heavy on my heart right now and I want to write about it, but doesn't necessarily fit into a larger picture or what I normally write about. That is a really good way to just be like, you know what, I'm just going to put this out there. It doesn't have to be attached to anything and it can still be valuable. It can still, you know, so I think that's a really, really good way to, again, and I know I keep saying it, but I just think the name of the game here is like just experimenting and seeing what's working.
Yeah. The throwing spaghetti to the wall and seeing what sticks is something that I it's like an image, a very strong image I had. And like, I definitely wasted a lot of spaghetti and I'm gluten-free. So that's really expensive spaghetti. So because they haven't made that stuff cheap yet. But it's something that I used to really identify with early on in my career. Now it's something I like very much like hate the idea of, like, I feel like being really intentional and knowing what you want. And like, but I really think that early on, and it's interesting that this conversation is sort of, there are two ways to come at it, depending on where you are in the career. I think experimenting is great. I mean, one of my first internships was as a tech at an engineer, like a mixing studio. And learned so much. The engineers were amazing. I learned how to patch and do all this cool stuff. But I also learned that I really liked windows and I did not like the smell of pot at 8 o'clock in the morning. And like, there was like certain lifestyle things. And that was me doing trial and error and like learning. You don't know what to be intentional about if you don't know what's available. So what you just said just reminded me of that. Like, yeah, doing some experiments, seeing what works. I think there's a lot of, I used to play in Quincy Market, like outdoors.
Wow.
You needed a permit in order to
Yeah, you still
there was
do.
like, 2 stores down was like a juggler and like, it was like all these random things. But I used to play with my band sometimes solo. And I would go for 3 days every month from New York to Boston. And I made a ton of money in tips, but I also could tell which songs people would stop and listen for and which ones people would keep walking by. They were really different songs than the ones that people would pay they would like buy a CD during a certain song, and I knew what songs those were. And then I also knew what songs wouldn't get a CD. It wouldn't get people to stop, but I would get tipped. So there was like, it was really good learning experience to learn about what songs resonated with people in that setting. And I was able to say, okay, these kinds of songs work better. And I think there's a lot of ways to experiment, and putting out a single is part of that. Last question for you regarding just the one-off single. When you put a single out, what do you do in terms of getting it on Spotify playlists? Is that something that's even possible if it's not part of an album, and releasing it? How do you look at the PR around and the promotion of just a single song?
Yeah, there are so many angles with it. I mean, Spotify is like the elusive golden ticket that everybody wants, right? And certainly there is a method through however you're distributing it to get it onto that, or at least submit it for a Spotify official playlist, right? But what I always suggest is sort of just finding blogs that have their own Spotify playlist, if that's your angle. Because I think if you can just remember that a stream is a stream, and that if you can start small, it still counts. And there are plenty of blogs and like people in the industry who have their own playlists, and just reaching out and doing that outreach and like getting on those playlists is a really good start towards some of those bigger goals that you have. And then, certainly obviously just blog outreach, like I talked about music blogs, but also non-music blogs that resonate with your message. And then, back to the marketing. I think that press aside, a lot of this, and especially singles, are so good for this because you can really narrow in your focus in a way that you can't with albums, is to just get super clear on the marketing of it. Maybe you have a really elaborate single release party, and you have, maybe you do like a VIP experience for your fans ahead of time, and you do like a potluck where they can all come in and you hang out with them, like whatever it is. Or maybe it's online and you run a contest around it. Just getting your fans involved and using that single as a way to connect with them in a totally different way. I mean, it's just gold. Like, that's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, making a big deal out of something is really, really important, and running contests and, polls and engagement things and live things, all that stuff. I think that's really great. So, which is a really good transition into, okay, let's talk about releasing a record. And now we've got an album coming out. You generally don't want to throw a big single release party a month before you have this big release of an actual album. And there are some bigger industry people that are looking at, like, you guys know I'm a dork, right? Everyone that listens to my podcast knows that I'm a big fat dork. So I am really into retargeting and numbers. And I've been talking with a lot of different companies just around what the numbers of the industry are looking like right now, and what is possible for an indie musician competing against these behemoths in the label world, and what makes charts and what makes retargeting ads possible and Spotify playlists. So I'm getting into all these numbers, and what I'm hearing over and over again is that singles are taking away from an album's weight, from the weight of a release, but they also create buzz for the album. So there's this very fine line that I think we can take some of the things that we're talking about with just a single and apply them to the album, but also apply them to the single, but in a way that's a little more strategic, because you've got to have the album in mind. So what are some things that you do differently when an artist of yours wants to release a single in support of an album?
Oh, I wish we had all day to talk about this. This is so fascinating. So what we do usually in a press campaign is we will usually release, say, 2 singles ahead of time. And if I had all the time in the world, I would release them pretty far apart, like a couple months apart. But you don't always have that luxury. And so it's releasing that single, and it's really, again, like we talked about, honing in on the message of that single as it ties into the larger album, because usually they do. And then sort of focusing on, again, you don't, like you said, you don't want to have a huge release party, but that doesn't mean you can't do things like, write a bunch of guest blogs, do a bunch of interviews, or take it to the next level. See if you can do Instagram takeovers on different blogs, or like with, a different band in your area, just things that are still getting you out there and sort of getting the message of the album out there through the single, without going crazy in the way that you would with if it was like just a single release type of thing.
Sure. So in a perfect world, you have a couple months between 2 singles. In a less than perfect world, when artists are doing the sort of last minute thing, how do you manage that when you don't have the luxury of 5 months out?
Yeah, I mean, usually an artist is coming to us about 8 weeks before their album comes out. And so we do usually 2 in that time. Like, we try to premiere one at the 8-week mark, and then one maybe a month or so later, or 6 weeks, depending. Sometimes you want to get it to premiere right before the album. But the reason I like to have more time is because it gives you, like, instead of rushing it, I feel like artists always want to rush it. They're just like, I want this single out, and then I want this one out, and then this one out. But I do think there's a lot of value to that build up, and like we said, telling that story where you can go, okay, here's this single, and we're going to not only send it to press, but we're going to also focus on what we can do for our fans in this single, and like all the things, so that they can really absorb it and get excited about it before you're, throwing something else at them. Like, in an ideal world, those singles, they should be all building on each other towards the album. The fans shouldn't feel like they are just getting bombarded. They should feel like they're part of a larger process, a larger story.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think that these singles, are they just being teased out on YouTube or other platforms, or are you actually going through your, CD Baby or TuneCore, wherever, and you're actually releasing the single as a separate need album art, all the things?
I say all the things. Yeah. I mean, again, I think experimentation, but I think this kind of brings us back to the larger discussion of the music is one element of your career, but you really have to be focusing on all the other things. If you're just relying on your music, like, I can see you running into problems that way. But if somebody, like, you have to focus on all that branding, and like we talked about, the experiments and like the connection with fans, right? Because if all of those things are in line, and you're really focusing on, like you said, loving on your fans and all of that, then you don't have to worry so much about, like, well, this exact timing has to be right, and this has to be, like, it's stuff to think about. You have to be intentional about it, but your fans will always catch you, even if you fall, if you've built up that relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the realm of releasing a CD, you're making separate cover art, or sorry, releasing a single, you're creating separate cover art, you're uploading it, it gets its own ISRC code. Then when it comes time to release the album, you don't want two tracks out there that are the same. How does one artist manage that?
I have no idea how distribution works.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the way it works is you assign an ISRC code, which is basically like the individual song. It's not quite a barcode, but it's the identifier for that song. And when you go in to release the album, you put that same ISRC code in so that it's still the same song, and then that song becomes part of the album. Is how I think you do that when you're uploading your songs, and there will be an episode of this about uploading and distributing in this podcast, so I'll make sure to put that in the show notes, that episode around just dealing with your distributor. I use CD Baby, and it's very obvious like where you can put in the ISRC codes, and sometimes I don't have them ahead of time, and they'll just assign them, or you can say I actually have an ISRC code and I put it in here. So I think that's something that makes it a little less daunting. The other advantage to releasing singles ahead of time, which we mentioned before, is that you can submit, as long as it's 7 days before the single comes out, you can submit it to Spotify to be on their Spotify curated playlists, and it will also go into anyone that's following you. It will go into their release radar the day that it's released. And actually, they say it's within the first couple days that it's released. It's not an exact thing, apparently. So that is an advantage. If you are thinking, okay, that seems like a lot, I just want to focus on the album, which is actually the tactic I've been taking with this Luminary album. I have been sort of leaking the music in other places. For example, Simple Habit and Insight Timer, to meditation apps that have versions of the music with spoken affirmations on top of it. So you can hear the whole album technically with me talking on top of it if you go to these apps. I also put those affirmations on YouTube. I've been making like very small clips for Instagram stories, so people can really listen to it. I've also uploaded to Bandcamp, which you can't get your music on Bandcamp through a distributor. It's a total little bubble. They don't play with anybody else. It's just Bandcamp. And yes, I was filing my nails. I'm holding nail file word. So the thing about Bandcamp is that you can set it so that people can preview a couple songs, and when they pre-order on Bandcamp, you can tell them, I also want to give away these couple tracks from the album. So I give people 2 tracks when they pre-order. Unlike on Amazon, you pre-order and then it just shows up in your Amazon account the day that it's released. You can't even listen to them. On Apple Music, you can preview them. So that every platform has a different way of working in terms of what happens before the release of an album. And I think on iTunes and Apple Music, if you have more than 10 tracks, so you have to have at least 11 tracks, people can get an automatic download. So you can set it so in the pre-order, when someone pre-orders on iTunes, if you have more than 11 tracks, one of those tracks they can get automatically. So that's another way of sort of, okay, here's me giving you a single without actually going through the whole process of releasing a single, not wanting to promote that, if that's part of the game. My CD unfortunately only has 10 tracks, so I wasn't able to do that on iTunes. So people just have to wait until it comes out. So those are some reasons to, some ways to actually sneak out singles without and create some buzz. And my email list, every once in a while, I'm just like, hey, here's a song from the CD just for you, just because you're on my email list. And I'll just like surprise them with a track. And I'm not releasing a single. I don't have cover art for it. It's just the MP3 from the CD. So that I think feels a little special for them, that they're like getting some inside scoop. You can't find that particular track anywhere else. I make sure of that, so that if you say something is an exclusive to your email list, you definitely want to make sure that it is in fact exclusive. But yeah, I think that overall it sounds like the idea is to release a couple singles, and depending on what you're doing with your album, that will sort of dictate how big of a deal you make of those singles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love what you said about releasing to your email list as well, because that's just another example of treating your fans well, giving back to them, and it's always, I mean, those are like your people, like they should always be your first priority, always.
Yeah, absolutely. I will put a link to the Rock Your Email List course, which is the program that sort of walks you through 100% how to do the email right. And it comes with all these templates, like over 40 different templates of different series, like welcome series, if you're releasing a CD, if you're going on tour, pre-written emails on like how to really get them engaged, what to say in the subject line, all that stuff. So I'll put a link to that. Angela, thank you so much for being here. If you had one more tip for all of the musicians, no matter where they are in their careers, around singles, what would you say that we haven't said yet?
I mean, it's kind of a catch-all, but really what I would say is that you have to build your relationships, whether it's with press or your fans. The number one thing you can do in your career, no matter where you are in your career, is you have to focus on building relationships every day, consistently, even if it's 15 minutes a day, it's going to make a world of a difference.
Oh, I love that. Just spending a little bit every day. That's so great. Where can people find you online if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so you can find me at either muddypawpr.com or angelamastergiacomo.com. And then Instagram is just Angela_Mastro.
I will have all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time. I know we could both dork out on this and there's so many. The other takeaway, of course, I'm like, we're done, and I'm not done. What I'm also really taking away is that there's so many different ways to do this, and there's none of them are right or wrong. And I think they're all just about like, what do your fans want? Are you connecting with them? Like you said, like the number one thing is just having that fan connection. And then you can kind of get away with anything, like do what's really calling to you. For me, I really wanted to focus on the record. Releasing multiple CDs or singles was like super not interesting to me. And, it feels like it's working. I haven't done a pre-order campaign in this way ever, and it's totally working. And then having stuff to sneak out is working for me. But I also see artists that are getting on Spotify playlists because of the single, and that's way before the album's going to come out, so that's going to really help the album. So there's so many different ways to do it, and that's another takeaway. It's like, not necessarily experimenting, because I really can't condone experimenting and throwing spaghetti to the wall anymore, especially knowing my listenership. But I think there is an element of trial and error, but also just learning, like talking to people and seeing what else is out there, what have other people done, and just sort of what resonates with you, and then being intentional from there. I could sort of fall into that place.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? It's like I think there's a point at which because I get stuck in research mode. I can just research forever and not do anything. And I think there is a point at which you go, okay, I've done my research, like I know my stuff. Now I have to actually be quiet for a second with myself and be like, what, like gut reaction, what resonated? What do I think is going to work? What do my fans want? And then just do it. Like, don't try to make sense of it. Don't try to justify it or talk yourself out of it because it's not like what the other person is doing. Just do it, because I do think at the end of the day, we tend to know what works best for us and our audience. And it's just a matter of learning to listen to that.
I love that. That is a perfect note to end on. Just do it. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you too.